But let's say that that oil, that OE oil or that XL oil is going to sit in that oil pan for a long, long time, and it may not get many miles or many hours on it. So what is the drain time on that then?
Okay, that's another good question that we'll give an answer to. Everybody understand that question? We have a time limit on oil, we have a mileage limit on oil, basically. And if the oil's not being used much, what's the time limit based on? Well, legitimately, the time limit on oil has to do with what you could refer to as cycles on the oil. And let me explain that. Now, it's a little different for what you're talking about, but I'll come back to it.
You know what I'm talking about.
If I have a vehicle that is started up in the morning and it's driven 5 miles to work and it's shut off, the guy comes out in the afternoon, cranks it up, drives it 5 miles home and shuts it off. So here's what happened. That morning when he cranked the car up, the oil was at 30 degrees, okay? Let's just say what climate we're in, where it is. But that oil was at some cool room temperature, 40, 50 degrees, right? He cranks it up, he drives it for 5 miles, maybe the temperature gets up to 140, 150 degrees, turns the car off. What's it do then? It cools down again. From room temperature to room temperature is one cycle. Then he goes out there and cranks it up in the afternoon, brings it up to room temperature, it comes up in temperature, he drives it home, turns it off, cools back down. That's another cycle, right? Now, every time the engine cools down from hot down to cold and everything cools off, what we used to call in the Navy cold iron, okay, as it cools down, if there is enough humidity in the air, depending on the time of day, it will condense moisture in the engine. Now, that moisture just trickles down in and falls in the oil, and it's no big deal, because the next time you crank it up, if you get it up above 140 degrees and hold it there for any time, it's pretty much going to vaporize out that water as it comes up in temperature, okay? Unfortunately, though, every time you go through this process, that added water that is in the system that comes in contact with the byproducts of combustion from the engine produces additional acids. Oil's got anti-acid capability, right? It's got alkaline neutralizers in them, so it neutralizes it and doesn't care. But the same process we just described could be for the guy that started the car up and drove 75 miles to work and 75 miles home. He did the same cycles. So what it turns out is that on average, if the car is being used, the number of cycles in a year will be pretty much the same for the guy that drives high mileage or the guy that drives low mileage. On average. You're going to have your outliers that aren't the same, but they can be pretty much the same. If a guy's doing 22 days of work a month, he's doing 2 cycles a day, that's 44 cycles a month. He does that times 12, right? He's at about 500 cycles. Now, he'd have the same 500 cycles if he drove 75 miles each way to work. Let's use 50, that's easier. If he drove 50 miles, that's 100. So if you go 2,200 miles a month times 12, 25,000 miles, a little over that, or he could be doing 5 miles to work and 5 miles back, which is 10 miles a day, times 22 in a month, which is only 220 miles, times 12, which is about 5,000 miles. So he did 5,000 miles with the same number of 500 cycles as the other guy that did 25,000 miles with the same amount of cycles on the way. So oil is beat up by the heat up and the cool down, the heat up and the cool down. So what you end up with is that companies have to have some type of way to evaluate how much they're willing to go through. So they come up with a time limit. You know, most oil companies don't have a year for petroleum oil. It's usually 3,000 miles or 3 or 4 months. That's the normal recommendation for oil. But remember, the average petroleum oil has a TBN, total base number, and Marty, that means total base number is the ability to neutralize acid. They have 6, some of them let 5, that's where the TBN is. So our oils, typically, our signature series oils are around 12, and our other oils run around 8. So there's no comparison in the actual ability of the additive package, but that's why they would recommend theirs for 4 months, and we would say ours is good. Now, your original question, it just sits in there and does nothing. No cycles, no nothing, just sitting there. In general, what I tell people that have like a classic car or something like that isn't used much, is that they really kind of have a choice. They can take that oil and they need to change the filter once a year, period. And the reason is that the filter sits in oil that contains ester, like ours, for a period of time, and the ester is going to be working on those fibers over the course of a full year. So I think you might get some weakened filter element depending upon what it's made out of, and you might find maybe, who knows, maybe month 14 or 15, you crank it up and it knocks little holes through the filter and just streams through the filter and doesn't filter. Okay, so filter ought to be changed once a year, period. But the oil, if you take that oil out on a dipstick and you take a perfectly white napkin and you take that dipstick and you let it drip on that napkin, it's been sitting in there a year. I'm going to tell you right now, if it drips on that napkin and makes a uniform stain,
Right.
and shows no ring around the outside of the stain, and the oil that you're looking at, it still looks like fairly new oil, it's not cruddy, dirty or anything like that, change the filter and drive it for another, let it go for another year. But at 2 years, give it up. Just give it up at 2 years.
Yeah.
That's enough time. You're going to be fooling around with too much of
So
a
you're
danger.
talking about all 3 lines or just the ester?
I would say I wouldn't run any of the XL oils for more than a year. In fact, they're rated for 6-month change intervals. I don't personally believe, from what I have seen from people in testing, that anybody's had any trouble with the XL oil when they haven't reached the mileage and they kept it in for a year. But remember, we're talking 2 things here. What could you get away with, and what does Amsoil warrant? The warranty says 6 months or 10,000 miles. Okay, so that you need to make sure your customer understands that. If you want to leave it in there for the year, you'll probably be okay, but it ain't covered by the warranty once you go past 6 months. Okay. Now, what do I think? If I had a car and I had X, I'd drive for the year. I don't think there's any problem with that oil for a year. Let me tell you what happens to petroleum oil when it sits in a pan for a year. You can try this yourself. Take some petroleum, anybody's oil, pour it in a pan, and just set it somewhere in your garage and leave it there. Come back in 6 or 8 months or something, sometime like that. Look, they'll also look the same, but it ain't, because as soon as you go to pour it out, you'll find a layer on the bottom, about like that, of waxy stuff. And what it is, the surface finally begins to react with oxygen. And as it oxidizes, it changes its structure and it sinks to the bottom. And it'll build up this waxy collection in the bottom of the pan from just sitting there. It doesn't have to be used, it just sits there. So what you need to tell somebody when they say, well, I just use some Valvoline in my treasured collector car that I have, and I never worry about it, and you go, well, listen, that's up to you. But most of these petroleum oils will run out of their antioxidant just sitting there in direct contact. And remember, these engines are vented. They're not closed off where they can't get oxygen inside the engine. The crankcase is not in a vacuum. It'll have air across there, and every time outside the temperature heats up to 100 degrees, well, the engine warms up and it pushes air out. Because the volume of the air heats up, it pushes out. Then when it cools down at night, it sucks new air back in. And every time it does that, it's bringing moisture, like a pump, in and out, condensing it in the engine. So pretty soon, that vehicle is sitting there. Now, there have been some people with collector cars that have certain vents on them to the atmosphere, caps on the valve covers. Over there have been people who've used a desiccant cap to put on there, which dries the air that's sucked into the engine. I don't think you need to go that far. Just put a good synthetic marine engine oil in the car, because the marine engine oil has an additional rust inhibitor in the oil, which will coat the inside of the engine and make it pristine. So just use, we have a 10W30, a 10W40, and a 1540 marine engine oil. And if that doesn't suit you, the motorcycle oils have extra rust inhibitors in them, which if you ask the motorcycle community, Marty's big in the motorcycle community, the guys would like to tell you they ride every week, but they don't. And so that motorcycle, it's a big deal to have a rust inhibitor in the motorcycle to protect that engine during the downtime. And you get it for free with Amsoil synthetic motorcycle oils. That every one of them, it's right on the thing. If you look, it's got that corrosion test that they do, and they show the Amsoil versus the is it Castrol?
Castrol.
Yeah, Castrol, motorcycle oil, and the Castrol motorcycle oil, the test tab is rusted, and the Amsoil, and it looks like it's never been in any weather. Just coated with the oil.
So you're saying in a farm application, you know, like a municipality who uses their tractor once every 8 weeks or every 12 weeks, you should be running marine oil in that?
Well, no, they just need to run that 50, most of theirs will be diesel, and that 1540 heavy-duty diesel and marine engine oil,
Right.
it has a rusted inhibitor.
Okay.
So they can run that oil.
And
But
then the
listen,
Z-Rod also.
and the Z-Rod oil, Z-Rod oils now have rust inhibitors in them. So it's a moving thing that's coming more and more. I'll bet you now that Amsoil led the way on motorcycle oils, we'll see a variety of motorcycle oils coming out showing that they now have rust inhibitors in them, because it's embarrassing when they don't, and they're rusting up the engines and they don't have it.
According